we need to recognise the cases and when these executive pardons happen. It happens when the court has already proved that person to be guilty, then it's when the court has already deemed that person to deserve some sort of punishment, and that punishment has been set by the court in itself. Even in these instances, the victims themselves are not given that power or even allowed to reduce that sentence or forgive that person. Yet in the context we're talking about, the executive pardons occur and exist where the government are allowed to forgive a person even after the court has sentenced that person and deemed them to deserve punishment. And we think from our side of the house that's something wrong, and that's something we need to take out of our system. We need to, our model is quite simple. It's in all nations with this law, but in nations where the judiciary and the executive are separate, so it's not interlinked. Our aim, or our stance that we're standing by, is that justice is the end, and it should never be the means to an end, and that's what we want to support. From our side of the house, we want to be very clear about what this debate is about and what we are talking about. We're talking about executive pardons, which are something that where the criminal are already tried, where that person has gone through the court trial, has gone through all that system, and has been found guilty, and has been deemed to deserve a punishment. We're not talking from our side of the house, and we don't think this debate is in any way about amnesties and so on, where you're unsure about the crimes, where you're unsure about whether that person is definitively guilty or not, whether that punishment is unset and so on. So we think there's a clear difference, although principally from our side of the house, we're also against amnesty. But for this debate, it's about executive pardons, and that's what we want this debate to stay on. So thank you. I've got two main points to bring up from the Prime Minister's speech. Firstly, about how the existence of executive pardons defeats the purpose of the justice of the victims. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how the existence of this pardon undermines the judicial system as a whole. So first one, we believe that it defeats the purpose of the victim's justice. There's two levels to it. Firstly, about the power play and the exploitation of this by the elite. So we need to recognise the fact that if a normal person comes up to me and say that person kills me, I would get justice because that person, that normal person, would go through the trial system, would go through the court system, and would be punished under the law that we have today. And in that sense, the victim would definitely get the justice that that victim would deserve for that harm that person would have got. But the fact is, when an influential person kills me, when someone important kills me, or when someone really big in society, or even in the, say like the drug cartels and so on, when they kill me, I get no justice. I may be traumatized, I may be tortured brutally, I may have my fingers cut off, and the way I get killed may be far severe than the same way than the case of when a normal person kills me. Yet, just because the state believes that the going through and the punishing of that person will have negative external harms, I do not get that justice. That person is not going to be sentenced to that punishment that that person should deserve, that that person has been placed upon that person through the court system which we have in our society. We think on that level, we believe that there's going to be an exploitation by the elite, where just because they are influential, their victims and the justice for that victim is going to be non-existent. That's something we do not like. Moreover, we see a situation where the justice is going to be based on a lottery. It's a case where the victim will only get justice when a non-influential person goes about committing that crime. And we think that having an aspect of lottery in something so important as the criminal justice system is something we simply cannot have in our society. We need to recognise the fact that victims deserve the justice in any situation or any case. The harm being done to that victim is the same regardless of who that perpetrator is. Just because it may be a normal person walking down the street, or just because it's a very important politician, or whoever it may be, the harm being done to that victim is the same, the action by that person is the same, and the intent by that person going about committing that act and that crime is the same. And we believe that in our criminal justice system, where we recognise the action and the intent to be a very important criteria, we think that's something we should keep as a criminal justice system, and that's the reason why we cannot have executive pardons existing in our society. We need to recognise the fact we're happy to have on our side of the house judicial discretion to stay as well. We're happy for that to stay, like plea bargaining, because we think there's a complete difference between that and the executive pardons. Firstly, the judicial discretion. This is enshrined in the law in the first place, and there is a limit to it. So therefore, you cannot just say complete forgiveness using this plea bargaining. There's a limit to there's an extent to which the bargaining can happen. So we think there's a clear difference between that and the pardons that we're talking about right now. And moreover, with plea bargaining, it may reduce to some extent the sentences, but still the victim will get justice because the perpetrator of the harm is still getting punished. And therefore, we are not pardoning them, we're not giving them complete forgiveness, which is something only this system, only this executive pardon goes about doing, and that's something we are completely against. So secondly, how it undermines the judicial system as a whole. We need to recognise the fact that in our society we see the two, judicial and the executive, as being a separate body. We see a separation of power that exists. However, by having this one law in society, by having this executive pardons, it paints a picture that says the judicial system is a substandard to the executive as a whole, in contrast to the executive. And we think that's something really harmful when we consider the fact that separation of power is very important. Firstly, we need to recognise the fact that judicial voices and their views are going to be seen as being somewhat wrong just because of the existence of them and the picture of them being substandard to the executive. We're going to have a situation where people are going to think that the judiciary is incomplete, that they need a state to overrule them, that they need someone to have a check and balance over them. And we think that's something that's going to go about causing problems where we see a situation where the state is going to be seen as having to need the power over the judicial system. Moreover, we need to think that there are cases when the judges need to make necessary decisions, very hard decisions, that even go against the opinion of the public. Case in point, the John Lennon being captured for drugs and so on when the public didn't want him to be. We think that it's going to be far harder for the judges to go about making these decisions when they do not have that freedom in being able to make these decisions, and we think they're going to be hamstrung by this existence of the state being over that judiciary. And we think that painting a picture of that happening is going to undermine the judicial system as a whole. So for these reasons, we're very happy to propose the abolishment of executive pardons. Thank you.
So I think the reason the Prime Minister didn't take any points of information was because of the blatant contradiction in their case. Let's point that out to you. When they say that justice is an end, not a means, but at the same time they are supporting plea bargains, that's a blatant contradiction and an existential contradiction to their case. Because plea bargains are essentially a means to an end, a way to get at the top, at the kingpins in the entire racket, in a way to actually reduce this guy's punishment because somehow the state thinks that, okay, I need to catch that guy. So therefore, at some level they are understanding and accepting that justice is more than just about the ends, and it's more than just about laws, and that there are deeper considerations. So that's the question of this debate. What is justice? Because that's what they want to achieve. Before that, the second aspect is that they seem to have a sort of proposal in which they say that even victims should have a right to pardon, even victims should have a say in the punishment. Let's point out to you why that doesn't exist right now. Because crimes are seen necessarily as crimes against a state. Because by committing the crime, the criminal essentially is influencing and impeding the state's ability to function. He is destroying the citizens' confidence in the state. And therefore, the state has a duty to protect other citizens and civilians, not just the victim, and to gain retribution and to gain closure for the entire society. So let's talk to you about what justice means, because they seem to think that it's just a set of written laws that have no hold and therefore are unadaptable. That's unfortunately wrong. Justice is a living, breathing thing. It has to be unique. It has to also be adaptable and changing. How does it happen? We have structures which interact with each other and in a sense administer that. But these structures sometimes can impede the ability of justice to be delivered. Let's take, for example, what they told you when they said they're against amnesty. That essentially means they're also against truth and reconciliation commissions. We have a fundamental problem with that. Because let's understand, what Truth and Reconciliation Commissions do accomplish is a larger form of justice and not just the mean legalistic sense of justice as a word, which is what they seem to be going by. They achieve the peace and closure for a large group of people who are being collectively traumatized by these events and want closure. This form of justice is not written in any books. It's not created by any laws, but it is something that works. It's something that has worked in South Africa. It is something that has worked post the Nuremberg trials, where you had a large sense of reparations. All of these things have been shown historically to work, and therefore it's not that they have been administered by any laws. So let's come to you about what justice really means, ladies and gentlemen. One is that it's not black and white, right? It's something that means that it's something that is meant to create human happiness for the entirety of that state. Something that is predicated and on the welfare and the continuing existence of that system and its ability to function. If you're only going to be limited by a set of books and what that says, you're essentially impeding the ability to adapt and to answer and to adapt to changing situations. Situations, for example, like Alan Turing, who was convicted for homosexuality and committed suicide because of it. At that time, it was not accepted, it was illegal. At this point of time, we have realized that that's wrong, and there's a move to pardon him. That can only be done by the executive, because the judiciary does not have a right to say whether or not a particular law is unjustified, only that it is unconstitutional. And that creation of that law is by the legislature. A legislature which is necessarily in many cases hampered by lack of consensus, a lack of ability or other political considerations, as we have seen repeatedly. The ideal example is India, where we have a law against homosexuality which provides for 5 years of imprisonment at the very least. The fact that it exists does not mean that homosexuality is bad, just that the legislature has been unable to change that law. It does not mean that it is a just law either, right? Therefore, if somebody is brought to trial for homosexuality, what happens to that person in India or say in any other country as just the like? He has to be punished by the court, because the court has no say in saying that this law is bad, right? Yeah. But then, if he has to, yes.
Sir, in India, no president will ever go ahead and say, I pardon someone who is a homosexual, because the conservative society within there is that big. That is why that legislature exists in the first place. That's why the parliament says homosexuality is illegal.
Mr. Speaker, again a concession of the means to an end. If we are talking about justice, it can't just be about what, it has to be at some point about what is right rather than what's expedient, right? Secondly, it's not just limited to books. It has to be more holistic than that. When there are limitations, and let's talk to you about the limitation, because I'm spending too much time on it. First of all, we need to correct past injustices, like I gave you the example of Alan Turing. Secondly, there has to be a sense of rehabilitation and reintegration of these elements, which is what justice is all about in the first place, right? How can that happen? It can't just happen by the court sentencing that person, which is why you have the parole system, which is why you have all of these systems to try and do that. But at some level, you also need to have a further system, because these courts are further hampered by by the institutionalized structures that they create. So let's understand therefore the role of the state. Let's take, for example, a crime of necessity. Somebody commits a theft or a crime, and that he has to be punished by the courts, because hey, it's in the court has no authority to not punish him. But the state recognizes that it's a fault and it is a failure of the state to protect that person, and that it was essentially a crime that he had to commit for his own reasons. And therefore, executive pardons provide an opportunity for the state, for the executive, to redress these wrongs that it has committed or it has forced these people to commit. There is a judicial shortfall. Let's understand. The judiciary can only administer laws, it cannot make them. The legislature makes the laws, but it has political considerations and implications, and therefore sometimes is delayed. When justice is delayed, it should not be denied. That's what the executive decision, that's what executive pardons are meant for, right? And that's what we talk about. Like, let's say, for example, we recognize legislatures which protect people, right? And essentially, we need to understand that the separation of powers is not absolute. In a state, the separation of powers is meant so that each of these institutions can work together to create a better society. And that better society is predicated on the existence of a whole all-round view of justice, and not just a verbose view on it, right? Essentially, when this side of the house says that we believe in justice, they are referring to justice as exists in the law books. We are referring to a larger concept which can only be held if you have this form of system which allows this to happen. So let's understand what they might also say, that, look, there's going to be, oh my god, it's going to be misused. It won't be, for two simple reasons. One, that there are checks and balances even within this, right? You do have people, and you do have the executive which has to take a decision. But second, even if there is a potential for misuse, we think that the potential for good like in the case of India and Pakistan exchanging prisoners as a goodwill gesture, is much greater and therefore must be allowed. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we are very proud to oppose.
Yeah.
Two arguments will be discussed in my speech. The first one, how executive pardons will manufacture a justice system which is premised on popularity in contrast to a righteous action. The second extension which I'll discuss about is to directly deal with the final substantive from that speaker, how their policy, which is on executive pardons, are premised on a fragile accountability structure to a point that their policy will weaken countervailing forces which exist within the system. But before that, a couple of rebuttals. The first one, how is this law different when it comes to plea and bargain? I think they missed the two nuanced substantive which were discussed by Yuki. The first reason why it's different, if you look at executive pardon, if you look at plea and bargaining, it's based on a definite system. I.e., if I commit rape, the maximum amount of punishment is 15 years, but the minimum amount of punishment might be 10 years. But that means it's based on a definite sentence in contrast to an ambiguous and arbitrary legal system which is premised on the executive. The second and biggest reason why it's different, because a pardon is an absolute pardon, which means that no justice, no retribution, rehabilitation will be given at all. In contrast to plea and bargain, you will at least get 10 years of imprisonment, which means that we can strike a balance. So if you compare it, ladies and gentlemen, their policy means that justice doesn't reach an equilibrium. Sit down. Second rebuttal. Their assumption was all crimes are crimes committed against the state. Therefore, the state should decide what's right and what's wrong. We agree. But the state representative is not the executive, but it is the judiciary, which is one of the organs of the state. That means the dispensary of justice can still exist under one of the organs of the state. We are only principally against this, not the state, but the executive deciding. The third one, is this debate about TRC and amnesty? Again, they miss the nuance in Yuki's speech. There's a big difference when you look at executive pardon and amnesty and TRC. What's the difference? If you look at executive pardon, the criminal must be brought to court, must be declared to be wrong and to commit a crime, and then be sentenced, ladies and gentlemen, and then the executive pardon will come in. In contrast to amnesty, the person hasn't been brought to court. The person must first dismantle all his arms and weapons and must follow certain sets of preconditions. We don't even know whether the person is guilty or not. Therefore, it's different. But even if, I'm still going to engage with them, but I want you to engage with our characterization, which is primarily in politicians who are corrupted, murderers, and people who are primarily popular but commit a crime. But even when I engage about TRC and amnesty, again we think this is principally unfair because of the three reasons which were discussed by Yuki, which wasn't engaged at all. The first reason, because this will weaken victims' justice. Because now justice is based on power play, how much power you have. Secondly, justice will be based on a lottery. If a strong person kills me, then I won't get justice. But if a weak person kills me, then I'll get justice. Not engaged. And it's also based on a balanced system, right? Where victims' justice will be weighed out with the needs of society, in contrast to your policy, where the needs of the victims won't be weighed out at all. All these three levels were ignored by the previous speaker. Sit down. The final argument which I discussed, or the final substantive, which I said, sometimes legislatures aren't able to change an unjust law, but the courts are forced to prosecute. Number one, we think there's a selective characterization of homosexuality just because it sounds nice, right? And people accept it. But what about cases of rape, murder, corruption, all these insidious crimes committed by a public, popular person? Now these individuals, ladies and gentlemen, directly stand against the interests of society. Why is it still insidious, even if you want to talk about homosexuality? Because now the executive can circumvent the demands of the people. Voters will no longer have the ability to decide between what's right and what's wrong, because the executive can easily circumvent voters' power and voters' will, so we think their policy will make situations worse. But I want to point this out, right? The second argument brought up by Yuki was completely ignored, how this undermines the judiciary system. The first reason, because it creates a hierarchy in the organs of the state. Now it's no longer fair. Now the executive is above the judiciary. The second reason, now the judiciary will be seen to be incompetent because it can easily be overruled by another body. But finally it becomes harder for judges to make tough decisions, but necessary decisions. All of this we ignored by that side. Yes?
Look, if you are talking about the lottery, therefore by that standard, just because one murderer is not caught, is equal reason to not convict any of the murderers.
It's not only one murder is not caught. Under your policy, executive pardons can happen at any point in time, any day, any person. That means based on an ambiguous framework, in contrast to a definite framework under our policy. First argument, justice based on popularity. What's the primal interest of an executive? An executive have a purpose incentive to make sure that they'll be elected over and over again, which is premised on popularity. This is problematic because justice will take a back seat because it's being sacrificed for these politicians to be elected again. Case in point, if you look, ladies and gentlemen, Radivan Karadze and what's his name? Ratko Mladic, the two war criminals who are currently suffering in The Hague, were initially pardoned by the Serbian government because they were labelled as war heroes, although they butchered, tortured and raped millions, not millions, like thousands of Bosnians during the Balkan Wars, ladies and gentlemen. You think this is something which is really problematic? The reason why it's problematic, because the executive now will primarily prioritize on saving people who are powerful, people who are backed up by the people, but more importantly, even if it means circumventing the real justice system and fulfilling victims' justice. It's different when you look at judges, because judges do not get elected again. Judges get appointed. Therefore, judges' main role is to ensure that justice is carried out, in contrast to an ulterior motive which is being elected again. Sit down. My second argument, how their pardons are premised on a fragile accountability structure. We think their policy will weaken countervailing forces. Because, let's listen, their countervailing forces is that, oh, if it's really that evil, the public can choose and decide whether it's right or wrong and can vote the government out. The first reason why that's detrimental, there's a timeline problem with that argument. Because the criminal has already exited prison and only 5 years later will you be able to vote the government out. That means victim justice is not fulfilled. The second reason, often in developing nations, these governments monopolize the media in that country, therefore can continuously go on a propaganda war saying that this guy is innocent, in just the same way how Ratko Mladic was seen to be a hero in contrast to a war criminal because of the media sensationalization which exists. The third reason, because the executive can easily deflect attention by looking at social policies, by giving subsidies, by helping other minority groups. I mean, they can easily deflect attention, people's attention, from the law itself. It's different when you look at judicial discretion, because judges' main priority is always justice. Because judges do not control the media, judges do not control other economic, social and political policies, because judges' main role are primarily discussing about justice. Where have we reached so far? I don't want to live in a world where if my mum gets killed by a dictator or by a rapist who is influential, ladies and gentlemen, to a point that I get no justice, my mum gets no justice, but I see the person walking down the road happily shaking hands with everyone at the expense of my justice, I'm absolutely happy to propose this motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, as Deputy Prime Minister himself tried very hard to show that there are different nuances and facets to justice, and that justice can be used to achieve many goals within society. And we don't think that it's fair for them or it's beneficial for them to try to remove one option by which the executive aims to reach holistic justice within society. When courts themselves are limited by their self-imposed restrictions, when legislatures are hampered by gridlock within their chambers and aren't able to pass meaningful laws or even repeal meaningful laws, who else can act but the executive? My substantive will be twofold. Firstly, I'll ask you to imagine a world without executive options. One, where the world is, where the law is that strict, unyielding, and inflexible, right? And I'll show you exactly why we need these options to begin with. Because the executive has many goals within, has a huge scope of what of the jobs they need to achieve and why they need that option to achieve that. But secondly, I'll deal with the idea of the respect for the law, which is something that side government want to achieve, right? But they seem to have a very simplistic and shallow view of what it means to have shallow respect for the law, which simply means that if you have a law, you must follow it by the book. There is no room for any deviation whatsoever. But at the same time, they're okay with amnesties and truth reconciliation committees. They're okay with plea bargains in order to get other criminals who they think are more important, which acknowledges in the end that even individual criminals or their trials can be used as a means to achieve a greater goal. And that's the nuance that they still haven't understood today now. I have 6 rebuttals to make, right? Firstly, this idea of popularity, very quickly, right? We think that justice must be holistic. We think he's absolutely lying when he said that Ratko Mladic and Radivan Karadze work hard, tried, and given amnesty or given pardons. They weren't. They evaded justice for for a decade, ladies and gentlemen. They were never caught until the end when they were sent to The Hague. Right? So we don't think that necessarily applies here. Secondly, let's talk about his substantive law, the lack of accountability, right? We think that the accountability that comes from the executive, knowing that it's a political post, is a huge public outcry. You're risking your political capital by pardoning people who have been convicted of crimes. Rarely, if ever, are rapists and murderers pardoned. They've simply had this broad rush saying that rapists and murderers are, if ever, pardoned. That's one. But secondly, right, let's acknowledge this. In fact, no pardons are instantaneous. There's no procedure where right after you're convicted, the executive immediately pardons you. They will usually take some time to vet it, to make sure that you've at least served some time, or at least to show that at least we've given the process of justice some time to run its course, and then we will consider pardons later, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, and this is more importantly, to this idea of victims' justice. What they're basically saying is that victims have a say in severity and execution of punishments. That's not true, ladies and gentlemen. If that were true, family members of those who were raped would not be content with simple imprisonment of these people. They would be happy with the torture and the execution of these rapists. And that's exactly why the state doesn't allow victims to have a say. Because the amount of the acts that victims' families might engage in are usually barbaric and uncivilized. And that's why we don't allow that to happen. We draw a line at when victims' families have a say, and they usually don't. Because the crimes are against the state, just something that Sadiq hasn't dealt with. Right? Let's deal with three very quick things, right? Plea bargains, obviously, right? We've already dealt with that. Secondly, Truth and Reconciliation Committees. These people turn themselves in and ask for justice, acknowledging that what they bring forward, what the information they bring forward can give lots of families closure. They would deny that on principle, the amnesties, the ability of these families to finally know the final fate of their loved ones. Lastly, is this idea of a luxury. Look, there's many instances in which, realistically, right, the criminal justice system can't catch everyone. Sometimes there's not enough evidence, right? Sometimes you just can't bring these people to trial. You can't catch every murderer. Does that justify not having the option to catch them at all? We think that it being a lottery is not a good enough reason to remove the option altogether. There are some flaws in it, but we think that the benefits far outweigh the harms. Yes?
On the one hand, you argue that murderers won't get your pardoning system, but then you agree that Ratko Mladic and Radivan Karadzic were given this pardon, although they committed massive murder.
They evaded capture. No one managed to catch them because they were hiding in Serbia, ladies and gentlemen. Just because you're hiding doesn't mean you're given pardon. I don't see I don't see where he's coming from here. Right, let's move on to this first idea of a world without executive pardons, right? Very simply, this was alluded to by Skander, right? It's a world where it's strict, unyielding, and inflexible. And we think that executive has a huge range of jobs, right? You're supposed to run, departments of agriculture, you're supposed to enforce the law, you're supposed to run the country, make sure that it achieves a certain goal. Now the problem is that the other branches of government, right, which are usually three, the judiciary, legislature, the executive, right, the other two are limited in what they can do. The executive has a huge amount of breadth, and that's when usually we admit that there's a huge effort by the court and the legislature to limit the powers of the executive, and we think that's a legitimate concern on that side, right? What happens if the executive abuses it? But we think at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that there is a method by which they are judged, by history as well. When Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon for the Watergate incident, right? He took that risk, right? He knew that it was a risk pardoning someone who had been implicated in committing something that was a crime. But at the same time, he saw that it was a method in which, to forward reconciliation, national reconciliation. The point I'm making here is that in the end, Gerald Ford was judged and is still judged for his action in pardoning him. Is he still politically relevant today? Maybe not, right? But the point I'm making here is that in the end, there is a form of accountability, but we need to have the wide option of flexibility that the executive is afforded. But lastly, and this is probably the pointy end of my speech, right? The respect for the law. We think that unjust outcomes destroy the foundations of the law more often than not, right? You can't expect the court has to mete out the law according to what the books say, right? But sometimes you can tell, sometimes they wish they didn't have to. But someone has to step in and be able to find a way out for these people to afford justice in a different way altogether. And let's point out very quickly, right, that it's not totally the executive superseding the judiciary, right? Sometimes when the executive does certain actions, right, the court can deem those actions unconstitutional. Similarly, right, and this is something what the side government don't acknowledge, courts are made up of judges who are humans too. they make mistakes as well. Now, we can't simply just let it slide and just remain set in stone. If everyone sees a clear injustice, even committed by the courts, who else should step in by the executive? And we think it's just reciprocating. If the judiciary can say that the executive is wrong and they can overturn it, then why can't the executive do the same and show that what the judiciary did was wrong and overturn it? We think that they've painted every pardon with a broad brush. We don't think rapists and murderers will be pardoned willy-nilly, ladies and gentlemen. There are very few instances in which the executive is willing to take the political risk of pardoning people who have been convicted in the court of law. We are proud to oppose.
Outgoing Serbian president decided to give pardons to over 7,000 people already found guilty by the courts and allow them back on the streets simply because he wanted to leave his mark as a president, and also what conspiracy theorists or The Economist says, also to free some of his political counterparts in jails. He simply allowed over 7,000 people to walk back down the streets. That possibility exists under the model of opposition and has occurred within the past month. Do we want to live in a society where courts tell you, where courts for definitely have found you guilty, and yet the president can simply set you free on his whim, on an ambiguous wish for him, right? We don't want that society. So this debate is categorized on two issues. First of all, I'll analyze, are greater goods, the hypothetical situations that they wanted to talk about, are they really reached? Second, I'll talk to you about the exploitation and the kind of harms they never really dealt with, right? Because first of all, they said that for the greater good, we must make some concessions. What are the kind of things they talked about? They said, oh, sometimes legislatures might be blocked within the parliament. But if you analyze why are legislatures blocked within the parliament, is because these are extremely controversial issues in the country we're talking about. The only country that homosexuality is banned in, right, not homosexual marriage, but homosexuality in itself, is Uganda. No president would ever give an amnesty to someone convicted of homosexuality, because he has no political incentive to do so. If he would be ousted out of power in the first place. The incentive of politicians in these cases is simply to ignore what is happening. Rather, we feel that these people will never be actually supported by the politicians, because the only reason legislature doesn't exist now and legislature is blocked in parliament is because these people can't agree that this law should be amended, and therefore this can't happen, right? Second, is that they said, oh, courts are unable, courts are rigid. We say no. Constitutions often allow courts to change laws all the time, right? First of all, and then they said, oh, courts can make mistakes. We say there are appeal systems. There are multiple judges that you have to convince in different divisions of the court. There are multiple juries that you have to do so, right? Second issue, we point you to the 1980s abortion law change in the United States, where even though the Constitution said that life is sacred and can never be taken away, the court decided that the interpretation is completely different and abortion should be allowed. We feel that courts can always make laws courts can always change laws simply to protect one individual if the law in itself is unjust. So therefore we say check and balance already exists. The third issue they want to talk about is, oh, a thief might be punished who didn't really deserve it. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, courts are always allowed to give leeway to people who they think did not have alternatives. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, often courts will even set free homeless people who are accused of going ahead. The famous example of when a homeless person, out of starvation, started eating his friend who was dead, right? Even this person was actually acquitted by the court because they're allowed to understand, consider the situation in which these people are in. So we think check and balances already exist within those circumstances. Before I move on,
So what about people who have been convicted by courts that were less brave than that before, but who now courts acknowledge as being fine? Retroactive justice does not apply.
Say it again, I don't get it.
What about people who have been convicted before by courts that were less courageous than the ones you talk about?
Because courts are allowed to take those decisions, number one. But even if a court makes that mistake, like I said, there are multiple juries and judges you have to convince. There are multiple levels of divisions, appeal systems that you can easily go through, right? You can even go for a mistrial if you think that the court was ineffective, right? So those check and balances already exist under our model, right? But they never really talk to you about the kind of closure for victims, right? Because they say, oh, people are not allowed to have a say because the crime is against the state only. We say no. The judiciary represents the victim as well. And the judiciary's punishment, one of the key objectives is to provide closure for those victims. they provide the possibility that these victims will never achieve closure, because justice is based on a lottery where you will only achieve justice if this person is not influential. We say that's fundamentally unfair and can never be allowed. Second, exploitation, right? Because they think that exploitation will occur and it's so awesome, right? They say, oh, and on the one hand they say, we will never allow criminals or rapists to go free. And then on the other hand, they want to support amnesty and TRC for dictators, right? I don't really get it. So essentially, they themselves crack their case by saying we don't support truth and reconciliation commissions, because they themselves are saying rapists and murderers will never be allowed free under their model. But second, we say murderers and rapists have been allowed free previously as well, right? We already gave you the example of Serbia. If you're not happy with that, I can give you more. We can talk about Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge regime right now is like a lot of those individuals are still in government, and because the government decided to give them presidential pardons, even though those people committed genocide within that country. We think this is the kind of harm that we face today if we allow this, if you don't ban this, right? But secondly, they never really responded to this idea of incentives, because one thing governments can do is they can avoid accountability through two measures. Number one is that often within these states, they will control media outlets, which means that these people will not have complete information about the kind of activities that governments do. Therefore, voter accountability doesn't exist. But secondly, talk about deflection of issues, right? People don't vote simply based on whether or not you allow one person to go free, or on a broad range of issues. And when a government can simply deflect issues onto other agendas, and therefore get away scot-free when it comes to elections. This is the kind of incentives that we talk about, right? So these people simply get away scot-free, allowing individuals to go down on the streets, not providing safety for people, and you allow people who have been convicted by the courts, deemed to deserve punishment, and then you allow them to go free. So what have we shown you here today? We have shown you that, look, this arbitrary idea of greater good being achieved by courts or by the executive where the courts fail is not true at all, because courts have multiple layers of accountability, multiple layers of check and balances, appeal systems, juries, judges, whatnot. We tell you that in states where laws don't protect these individuals, where unjust laws exist, it's because that government in the first place wants those unjust laws to exist and would therefore never allow amnesty for someone who would deserve it in the first place. But we also told you about the massive levels of exploitation that has occurred. We tell you about Serbia, we have told you about Cambodia, where people who committed genocide now run the country itself, simply because you allow a government or an executive body to give presidential pardons. We are supremely proud to propose.
No contradictions towards the previous speaker's speech, which we will address later. But what has been started off by the government bench is that they want a strict separation between the jurisdiction and the legislation itself. When you're looking at the ability of now, you are claiming that courts have the ability to modify laws, Mr. Speaker. We claim, what about the criminals that has been previously acquitted with those particular laws itself, Mr. Speaker? What does that happen to them? We claim that the executive pardon exists in certain circumstances where it strikes a balance. Under their impression from the government bench is that the executive pardon exists immediately once a particular crime once a particular decision by the court has been made. We claim that the same process or the time constraints within the plea bargaining also exists within the idea of executive pardon. You're looking at character references. You're looking at the ability or the rationality of individuals, such as the executive of the particular state, making a choice that is immediately, directly affecting the state as well as the law itself. And under their circumstances, if the third speaker of the side of government is claiming that the laws are modifiable, we then state, why can't the executives do the same as well? When you're looking at the rationality of individuals, especially when you're looking at how the courts are following the laws by the dot, Mr. Speaker, you have the ability to change the interpretation, but you can't change the law to its extent. So we claim that in the end, when it comes to the idea of executive pardon towards certain individuals, the consequences in which these executives, for example the President, taking a decision, Mr. Speaker, not overnight, but rather a certain period of time, to grant pardon to certain individuals. One, we don't think a president will immediately free a rapist just because he rapes Sadiq's mom. But I think we rather look at the consequences of what is a crime and exactly what was the intent of creating the crime itself, Mr. Speaker. They fail to recognize that laws really doesn't evaluate the intent, but rather looks at the merits of what a crime is and what it is in a very apparent manner, Mr. Speaker. we also need to look that executive pardon exists as a choice to work as a check and balance, so that we further then can evaluate the intentions of an individual doing a particular crime itself. We think that to the extent of how, which is going to be the first class of this debate, Mr. Speaker, do we undermine the justice system? We claim no. In the end, the integrity of punishments still does exist, Mr. Speaker. When you're looking at the President of Serbia releasing the 7,000 prisoners, Mr. Speaker, we can also draw a parallel example towards when Lincoln, and I'm saying this because the movie was just released, releasing all the Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. It doesn't matter what the consequences were before, but rather looking at the evaluation of what can be perceived from here on now, Mr. Speaker. So the rationality of individuals making those particular choice exists on two stands. One is that we're not going to take you for granted, Mr. Speaker. How is that so? We just don't simply deny the crimes that you've committed. But exactly when free bargaining is given to you, you are conceding that you are guilty to your crimes that has been done before. So just because we release you, doesn't mean we're actually telling a killer has been released by the street, but rather you are being released based on the accountability of a balance between the victims as well as the state's interest. But let's just look at the, let's just look at the consequences in which these politicians take into consideration, or these executive powers, in releasing someone, Mr. Speaker. We have given you plenty of examples. When Gerald Ford granted pardon for Richard Nixon, he understood the consequences that was involved. Yes, he received the criticization, Mr. Speaker, but in the end, the rationality of pardoning someone, Mr. Speaker, was taken into account. So yes, they are willing to sacrifice their political capital, they are willing to sacrifice some essence of their stand in the government party, because they know, in the end, it might be worth it to release this individual, Mr. Speaker. And this is how we take to the extent of justifying that because it is your people, the citizens that voted these individuals into executive power, we should respect their rationality, Mr. Speaker. We can't just simply assume that corruption can take place. In the end, corruption can also exist if a judge were to make a decision, right? So let's just assume it exists on both parties. In the end, the ability for someone to create certain repression, Mr. Speaker, of the punishment and the law itself is done based on two reasons. One, we understand that there is a different necessity and there's a different intent to the act of that individual itself. And on the second level, we understand that sometimes the law itself may have acted unfairly towards this individual. But Mr. Speaker, the justice system is not perfect, but it can never be as good as we claim it can be, Mr. Speaker. So in the end, you must serve a proper check and balance so that people have an arbitrary reason to go against the court, not going against the laws entirely, but exactly evaluating the intent of an individual. Which comes down nicely to the second biggest question. Do we undermine the rationality of the courts as well as the executive powers? When we're looking at the state itself, Mr. Speaker, in the consequences that is involved, we think that ideally when you grant pardon to certain individuals, the first cause is that yes, there is a certain waiting period. But on the second level, there are character references. So that means it's not one particular individual making this choice, but rather it's a constant evaluation of the reasoning in which why we want to release this person itself. The main clause of granting executive pardon is to really rationalize on whether or not this person had already received enough punishment itself. Sometimes death penalty is immediately given to certain individuals, Mr. Speaker, but in the end we understand that maybe that is not the end mean of how this person should receive the justice. Let's just look at the New Delhi rape case, right? The one individual that was under the age of consent, right? Under the age of adult. If this individual were to be granted immediate death penalty just like everyone else, then there might be some purpose for the executive power to actually grant some form of leeway for this individual itself, Mr. Speaker. So we understand that we're not exactly letting this person scot-free, but we're thinking that there's a different interpretation of how these individuals can receive their punishment itself. Under the paradigm of government, Mr. Speaker, the rationality is neglected. You are making a choice based on merits and not necessarily based on intent, Mr. Speaker. Executive pardon exists because it actually pushes individuals to understand what is the different side of a particular act of crime, Mr. Speaker. In the end, releasing someone doesn't mean we are actually taking away the justice for the victims, Mr. Speaker. In the end, it's about striking a balance. So even if you are actually a victimized person of this particular crime, that doesn't mean we have neglected the law and how you exercise your own rights. These individuals make a particular choice, Mr. Speaker, because we think that there is some benefits and some merits for this individual to regain their rights if it's applicable, Mr. Speaker. So for all these reasons, executive pardon should exist as a choice. It should exist as a certain measures of a check and balance the justice system. It's not perfect, Mr. Speaker, but it's definitely as good as it can get. We're very proud to oppose.
So side government has essentially conceded itself out of this debate. So let's look at what the concessions they made. First, when they say that their entire aim is respect for the law and to foster a respect for the law, then when they concede that courts can and should change the law, in a sense they have already said that the laws are not meant to be respected, or B, and this is slightly more insidious, that the laws themselves are fallible and therefore the courts are also fallible. Second, when they first came and said ends, the law, the justice is the ends and not the means, but then at the same time concede with plea bargains as a way to get at somebody bigger, then they have conceded a larger idea of justice, which is what we were talking about. Third is when they talk about a strict separation. In the very first speech when they said we believe in a strict separation between the organs of the state, but by the third speech they came up here and said, well, we're okay with courts changing law if it's really bad. Whereas if you look at it from a purely strictly point of view, that's the legislature's job. Moreover, as Mark pointed out, courts can't repeal a law, they can't go contradictory to an existing law. All they can do is interpret, which is what they said, right? They said the courts can interpret a law. The interpretation cannot be completely inaccurate. I can't call a spade a waltzing duck and be happy with that. So let's really look at what this debate is about. Because ultimately what we have been telling you about is a larger holistic viewpoint of justice, about what justice is supposed to achieve in a state and what the different organs of the state are supposed to do to foster and achieve this justice. What they have talked about is victims' justice, which, as Makita pointed out to you, is purely retributive and will not really help the state as much as make the victims feel slightly happier at the cost of human rights all round. So first of all, the idea of justice is that A, it has to be ever-changing and it has to be adaptable to the times. What was illegal, say, 5 years ago, homosexuality will not be illegal today or tomorrow as times change. But moreover, this might take some time and resistance simply because legislatures are too busy doing other things or are not able to foster create the kind of consensus for whatever reasons. They have different calculus there. Does that mean that you should prevent people from being unjustly crucified for that reason? Therefore, which is why we told you about the executive pardons as a means of fostering that justice and to create true justice. Secondly, when we told you about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, when Mark talked to you about the pardon of the Confederate soldiers, really we are talking about a larger idea of justice and not purely the meaner idea of justice in terms of punishing people, right? In a sense, what justice is supposed to achieve is for the state to continue to function and for everybody to be able to prosper. That can only happen if you're able to ensure that everybody feels fine and secure. One person feeling fine and secure because he got the right to chop off the rapist's testicles does not make the rest of society any better for it. But more importantly, if we are talking about making the world a better place and making the state a better place, it's important for us to understand that injustice cannot be accepted. That's something they have completely refused to engage with. Because A, we talked to you about how the courts are not perfect. B, that how you cannot catch everyone. And thirdly, that it has to be more holistic. They have neither tackled our holistic argument, but more importantly, when we ask them the rational calculus, because by their calculus, they're saying that the potential harm of one influential rapist being freed is not enough to justify the capture and continued detention of hundreds of homosexuals who have been unfairly detained under a law that should not exist. What is the rational calculus for that? How have they evaluated that choice and decided, no, we are going to allow 100 innocent people to remain in jail just to prevent one rapist from not being removed, from not being freed, is something they have never told us about. Unfortunately, their concessions are fatal to their case, but B, the lack of nuance that they have brought out through the three speeches is something that has not forwarded their case at all and prevented us from actually having a much better debate that is. It's about striking a balance, as Mark said. We are trying here to create a larger idea of justice, which one organ of the state alone cannot administer, especially given what they said about separation. We need to create an idea of a state and an idea of justice that encompasses all three organs. We have told you with checks and balances about how executive pardon can achieve that without necessarily causing the harm that they seem to cause, Ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to oppose.
I'll make this as clear as possible. I'll answer 4 questions which are the determinants of this debate. The first, does victims' justice matter? Second, which policy destroys the integrity of the judicial system. The third one, righteous justice against justice premised on popularity. And finally, under which policy is accountability better? A policy which is premised on the judiciary, which is not influenced by the media and also not influenced by being voted again, or the other policy where influences and deflections can exist. Something which until now I haven't heard a response to. So first, does victims' justice matter? The rebuttal to all three levels brought up by my Prime Minister was merely a whiner, was a one-liner. It doesn't matter. If victims' justice really mattered, then obviously these people would want torture. That's when we need to moderate our line, which we told you. Under our policy, we can strike a balance. I.e., now we'll give this person 15 years worth of imprisonment in contrast to 20 to 30 years. Under their policy, that balance doesn't exist at all. Because their policy will empower the rapists and murderers who can walk down the street. At least under our policy, there will still be some form of punishment. The representation of the victim happens by the court, and that's what we stand for. So obviously, if you look at the balance, obviously we will win that debate. But what did they miss and which they didn't engage? Number one is the exploitation of power play. Often people who get this amnesty and justice and everything are people who are influential. That wasn't engaged by that side. Furthermore, we also told you that now justice will be premised on the lottery. And the response was the same thing over and over again. But you made a concession about plain bargaining. I give you two reasons already what's the difference. I think I'll allow you to assess it. I think that's quite fair because after I told you they didn't engage with it after that, right? So I think on victims' justice, we will win it because we are able to strike a balance. Under your policy, victims get nothing. I think that's quite clear. The second policy, the second discussion is about the integrity of the judicial system. I think we clearly win this point, right? Because we had no engagement. What did I tell you? The first one, under your policy, you will create a hierarchy in the organs of the state. Because now the executive stands above the power of the judiciary, not engaged. We also told you under your policy, you will paint other judicial decisions to be wrong and incomplete because the state can correct it, not engaged by that side. So I think on the second clash, we have clearly won that debate. The most contentious issue will be the fourth one. That's the third one forward, right? Righteous justice against justice based on popularity. And this is something which they miss. Because the primal mode of the executive is to ensure that they will always get elected over and over again. The linchpin of their case, right, is that the reason why we need to do this is because if we don't, bad consequences will exist. Often, that's not the case. The reason why executive justice is being executed is because people want, the executive want to get elected again, right? Because they want to empower their party. That's why 7,000 Serbs were released. That's why the Hammer trial, a lot of people were pardoned because these people can join back the party. It's not because these people will wage war. It's not because there will be better consequences. It's because at times the executive is self-interested. And we contrast that towards the judiciary. The judiciary primarily stands because they get appointed is for justice. And that's something which they haven't engaged from that side of the house. The final part is on accountability. I think this is where it's quite funny, right? They said, oh no, chill guys, we won't release murderers and rapists. But then they're fine with giving amnesties towards dictators, people who have committed mass atrocities and war crimes. And we give numerous number of examples. We didn't hear a response there. But what's the two nuanced analysis which we brought to you, which wasn't engaged at all? I want you to look back. The first reason is because voter pressure can't exist because it's really easy for media pressure to exist. And the media is largely monopolized by the government, therefore misinformation can easily be spread. The second unique difference which I drew is that the executive can dispense other political power, i.e. giving subsidies, that means drawing attention away from the court trial, from the trial, to something else. Those two crucial analyses weren't engaged by that side at all. It's different when you look at judges. Judges are neutral. Judges do not control anything else. They have no political power to give subsidies and anything else. Where have we reached so far? We strike a balance where victims will get some form of justice, in contrast to their policy where victims will get nothing, but we'll see the politicians who before this murdered their brothers and sisters smiling on the screen in just the same way how the Khmer Rouge trial failed because of the pardon system.